I would like to invite Dr. Neus Figueras Casanovas to the stage for our last plenary of the day of the conference. Dr. Figueras Casanovas has extensive experience working on CEFR projects and publishing on this framework of reference. Today, her plenary focuses on the role of assessment in successful language learning. Dr. Casanovas, the stage is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the British Council for inviting me to be here, to TEFLIN, to the Ministry of Education in Indonesia, and to the New Directions team, which has made everything ever so easy. So thank you very much. And also thank you for being here after a long day. I hope that the session is interesting enough for you to have stayed, although you may be waiting for the networking event. I don't know. I'd like to focus on, can the presentation go? Yeah. I'd like to focus on two aspects in the first slide. One is the word assessment, and the other one are the figures on top. Although we seem to be talking about assessment all the time, during the day, so far, we've been talking about assessment, equating assessment and testing. And I'll be looking at assessment from a wider perspective that will include either individual assessment, group assessment, peer-to-peer assessment, and self-assessment. I'm not going to go deep into all these, but I would really like all of us to think of assessment as a general term rather than as a term describing tests or standardized tests that we've been talking about. So far in the conference, we've been referring to the comprehensive learning system, to standards, to the handbook that helps aligning any language education program, including curriculum, textbooks, methodologies, assessment to the CFR, and we've referred to the need for achieving systemic coherence and transparency, establishing a basis for principled comparison, and monitoring for purposes of quality assurance. We've already been discussing all this, but I'd like to draw our attention now to the teachers and what they do in their classrooms, and how come that in 2022 we still discuss this when for a number of years, more than 50, I'm not going to go back more than 50, well, yes, I will, more than 70 years, although I'm not 70 yet, but near, because in fact, assessment has been present for many years in any education program, language education program. But if we think of Ralph Tyler in 1949, when he published his first book on curriculum design, he talked about educational purposes, which Nino talked to us about this morning, educational experiences, and educational experiences effectively organized. But principle number 4 was, how can we determine whether the purposes are being attained? And this should not only be the role and the duty of a standardized test at the end of the process. It's far too late. I remember, for example, researchers like David Noonan, who said that if you use test results at the end, you're using spies when you've lost the war. You need spies to help you during all the battles, so that by the time you end all the battles, you know whether you're going to win the war or not. So it's important that we think of how to check whether the purposes have been attained at the end, but also work on checking whether purposes are being attained day after day, week after week, unit after unit, etc. So it's not only Ralph Tyler who worked on this in 1949. There's many other researchers working on this. I don't know if you'll remember that in 1996, Leo van Leer talked about the triads in language learning, and he talked about awareness, authenticity, and autonomy, the 3 A's, which are needed for students to make progress in their language learning. And he said that all this leads to a feeling of knowing. But he also pointed out the need to consider a second triad, which was also AAA: achievement, accountability, and assessment. And the link between these is what makes the feeling of knowing certainty of knowing, knowledge about assessment. So, sorry, knowledge of success. So later, there's another author who talks about what we teachers have done forever. We always have an agency that calls for a standard. There's a policy definition of that standard, which is the curriculum. Then we elaborate that curriculum into lesson plans, into test constructs, and then we develop our tests or our assessments. He talks about tests because that's his job, but we talk about test assessments and content, and then comes the crucial moment: how good is good enough? A standardized test will tell us how good is good enough, but we teachers should also know how good is good enough and have the instruments that will help us talk about how good is good enough. And last but not least, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of Dylan William, who says something which is, I think, blatantly obvious. If students learn what they are taught, we would never need to test. We just keep records of what we had taught. And this is unfortunately not the case. What we teach is not what our students think we are teaching, and they may be getting something else. Or maybe we're not teaching it properly, and they know, but they can't learn. So this is so far what we can say that has been around for 70 years in relation to the needs to make sure that language curricula, language teaching, and language assessment, which is part of language teaching as well, go hand in hand, which has not always been obvious this morning. And then, if we go on, we could talk about John Trim, the person who spearheaded the development of the CFR, who in 2011 talked about the need for tests to be honest, reliable, valid, transparent, and portable. So the questions for teachers and for classrooms is how to cope with the existence of these concentric circles. The lighter ones at the center explain what goes on in the classroom, what types of assessment go on in the classroom. And the darker circles are the types of assessment that are delivered internationally, nationally, or regionally. And the key question is, how could we relate the lighter blue to the darker blue? When we talk about teaching to the test, we've talked about this 2 or 3 times this morning, we should consider why are we expected, or why do we want to teach to the test? Shouldn't it be enough if what we did in the classroom really matched what's going to be in the test, and the test really matches the curriculum? We could go back to the triangle now. If everything is integrated comprehensively, we should not worry about teaching to the test or about planning our courses in relation to the contents of a test. And the additional issue that teachers have to contend with is that they wear many hats. Sometimes they need to help their students self-assess themselves. Sometimes they need to help their students understand what the summative test will be about. And sometimes the teachers are responsible for giving the scores, and telling the students whether they pass or not pass. And in this aspect, the teachers are faced with a responsibility of giving feedback, positive feedback to students who struggle, so that they keep struggling throughout the year, knowing that at the end, that student may not be good enough to promote. So this wearing 2 hats is sometimes a conflict for teachers, having to look after the students, making them aware that they are making small steps in their progress, knowing that they may not get at the end to the level they are expected to get. And in fact, doing this, equating assessment and testing or comparing assessment and testing, is easy to understand if we think on the difference between passing a course and getting a certificate, or formative assessment and summative assessment, or assessment for learning and assessment of learning. While we give feedback to our students during the teaching learning process, we show a mirror to our students, which needs to be clean and of good quality so that the students see themselves. And that mirror may contain small tutoring sessions, portfolios, feedback, individual or group, fostering self-assessment, fostering peer assessment, whereas in order to pass a certificate, we take a picture. But when the picture is taken with a good camera and you've been looking at the mirror and the mirror is good and it's clean, there should be no discrepancy. So the aim for the classrooms is to try and work during the learning teaching process in a way that the final picture will not come as a surprise to anybody. There's a number of resources that you can access to find information on how to improve learning through assessment in the classrooms. And there was a group that is not existing anymore, but you can access their work in the website. Improving learning through assessment depends on 5 deceptively simple factors. I'll give you 2 minutes to read, well, 1 minute to read it. This looks normal, I would say, most probably to you. Yeah? And this needs to live with the key questions in quality assessment that we also referred to during the standards panel, which are elements in quality testing. I've selected this book by Bachmann and Palmer, which talks about the usefulness, the need for tests to be useful. And they talk now about assessment. They started talking about language testing, but now everybody talks about assessment. And sometimes it's not clear whether they mean testing or assessment in the classroom. And there's 6 key issues that you can find in the ILTA standards, the ALTE standards, the quality matrix by ALTE, the EALTA standards, and any book on standards for language assessment, which are validity, reliability, authenticity, interactiveness, practicality, and impact, which incorporate different types of assessment, self-assessment, group assessment, and the main objective is fairness. And this is referred to by Bachmann and Palmer as usefulness. There's many other ways to skin a cat, but basically these are the items that you need to think of when talking about quality assessment. On the one hand, think of the slide on the 5 key questions to take on board when doing classroom assessment to improve students' learning, but also whenever you develop any assessment in your classroom, try to remember these principles, which may be applied to with more or less rigor, depending on the stakes that are attached to the decisions that you make. We talked about before, I think that Professor Sullivan talked about that in the morning, consequences. So depending on the consequences, the rigor that you need to apply to your decisions will vary, which is only normal. So in order to do this, and I don't think I prepared this, but I don't know if you have time. I'll leave you 30 seconds for those of you who are not familiar with the usefulness framework to have a look at. where there's brief definitions of each of the terms. Validity we've talked about, reliability we've talked about, authenticity is key in the classroom and in any assessment endeavor, be it standardized tests or not. Authenticity is related to relevance, to students' motivation, and to validity as well. You need to incorporate in your teaching and your assessment what your learners will be using the language for, so that they can see that what they're doing is useful. Interactiveness, if it is authentic, it should be also interactive, fostering the ability of the student, the learner, to engage with the task. Some tasks are boring, and the students do not like boring activities, whether they are in the classroom or in a test. They do not pay attention, proper attention to activities which do not generate motivation, and they could do better if they were. Impact, sometimes referred to as washback as well. I'm not going to go into the differences. And practicality above all. Practicality means that some things can be done in the classroom, some things cannot be done in the classroom because you're home alone and you cannot. You may read a lot of literature, and then you may decide that you're going to prepare for your summative assessment a system of collection of student recorded performances. If you have 3 groups of 40 students, this is not viable. It is not viable either to spend too much time on testing, because classroom time is for teaching and learning. And learning includes assessment, but not necessarily a test every morning, a test every Monday, or a test every Friday. So we need to balance out the capability of assessing what has to be assessed. Remember the triangle again, and also do things practically. Some things cannot be done depending on where you work, depending on your students. So it's localization, but also looking after the diversity in your classroom, but also in your school. You may be teaching, you may be the only teacher in the school, but you may not be the only teacher in the school. So it might make sense to work with the other teachers as well. So, assessment literacy. What we've been talking about boils down to assessment literacy, knowing more about assessment. Who needs to know that? Some time ago, there's been a lot of work done on classroom on assessment literacy, and Linda Taylor published an article in Language Assessment Quarterly on assessment literacy, which has actually inspired most of the research done during the past 10 years. And she talks about 3 main skills: knowledge, abilities, and principles and attitudes, which the CFR labels as savoir, savoir-faire, and savoir-être. I don't know if Masashi, who's learning French, will understand this. I think you will. Savoir is knowing content. Savoir-faire is being able to put that content into practice. And savoir-être is being ready to change your beliefs, to change your attitudes, to match what you've learned as a savoir and what you are expected to do to put that savoir into practice, which is the savoir-faire. And then knowledge includes theory. We talked this morning about describing language. We talked about levels, the vertical descriptions, but we talked about the action-oriented approach, which is the horizontal approach, which describes what a student, a learner, can do in the language across the different levels. So it's not only how well you can do it, but also what you can do it, in which conditions, with which texts, in which contexts. So theory, principles and contents. I reviewed very, very briefly some principles and concepts which have been around for a number of years, and then talk about marks, scores, and decisions. In the session I just went to, the presenter talked about standard error of measurement. And she said that when she was working for the Ministry of Education in the UK, this was not liked by her bosses, to talk about the fact that any results of any test cannot meet the real score that that student would deserve. We always make some errors. So it's the standard error of measurement, which is something that we have to take into consideration. We know that we need to think about this. And as teachers, the first step is to think that when we give a 4 means relatively little. A 6 in France is a fail because they mark over 20. A 6 in Spain is a narrow pass. And a 6 in Turkey is also a different score. So figures may mean less than descriptors. So this obsession with scores may not always be a good thing in our classrooms. So then there's the abilities, didactics. We all have done courses in didactics and methodology. And what happens? We've given courses and we've taken courses. But when we've given courses, trainees seem to find everything very normal and very doable. But when you go and observe them 2 weeks after finishing the sessions, you realize that they've gone back to teaching in the same way that they were taught when they were going to school. So courses on didactics need to be reconceptualized, perhaps instead of thinking of top-down, more bottom-up, and making trainees more reflective to see what has to be changed, and then making sure that we put the resources necessary so that this keeps over time. Developing activities and giving feedback. Giving feedback is an art. We give feedback by looking at our students. We give feedback with our comments. We give feedback with the color of the comment, of the pen which we use to give comments. So feedback is an art which needs to be trained for and applied carefully. Bad feedback may demotivate the students, who will hate you from the very minute they don't like the feedback or the look you've given them when they made a mistake. And then there's principles and attitudes, making sure that you know what the context is, and making sure that you know about the assessment culture of that country, that region, that school, and the group of students. Issues to address. The first one is conceptual, making sure that we know what we're talking about. We talked about standards, having a clear definition of what we are teaching, what we understand by language, and what are our objectives. And if this is clear, the assessment construct can be clear as well. But if we don't have a clear idea of what we're teaching, we do not have a clear idea of the assessment construct either. And we cannot use the assessment construct of a language test to inform our curriculum necessarily. Methodological. We need to operationalize the construct onto usable frameworks, models, and approaches for teaching and assessment. And practical. Disseminating the above, achieving a shared understanding, and developing materials and training. These three have to go together. And these three are another way of looking at the three terms in the triangle: curriculum, assessment, delivery. When we talk about delivery, we're talking about methodology, but also about practice. When we talk about curriculum, we talk about concepts. But we also talked, after having listened to Nina this morning, practicalities. Curriculums which are too much are way above the teachers, the students, and the testers. And then less is more. That is something that we should perhaps remember clearly. And we need to be clear which information do we give to whom. So, summary and conclusions. I think I'm going too fast, but anyway, you're welcome. I'll welcome questions. Learning, teaching, and assessment need to be approached as a whole. To do so, learning and teaching and assessment need to be rooted in robust conceptual frameworks, operationalized clearly in a way that can be understood by all involved. I'm not saying that the same texts can be circulated to everybody. Not everybody can read policy documents, but policy documents need to be useful and user-friendly to all stakeholders that are going to be using them. Counting with clearly defined standards is key, whether they are the standards are the CFR, which, by the way, I don't think we've insisted enough today, that the CFR, the title of the CFR is Common European Framework of Reference, semicolon, Learning, Teaching, and Assessment. So that's something to remember, yeah? The 2001 version and the 2020 version also focus on the triangle again. And change will take time. Shortcuts will not work. We talked about this morning that 20 years after the publication of the CFR, Anik reminded me that some of us actually had the opportunity and the punishment of having to read the CFR in 1996, the first version, then the second version, then the third version, and then in 2001, the final version. So more than 20 years. I would say that the CFR has been around for 25 years. And you saw today the amount of tensions, how many tensions we still have to struggle with. So it will take time. Shortcuts do not work. And collaboration is key. And with nothing else to say, I'll give you thank you. And these are... Maybe we have time for one question, if that is possible. Yes? Oh. Yeah, maybe yes. I don't know if question time was planned, but if we have time.
Okay. Oh, yes, you can hear me. That's working. Yeah, thanks very much. That was really good. Thank you very much. Steve Adams from British Council, Singapore. When I look at the various frameworks that have been presented, including, the comprehensive learning system and the others and so on, I wonder if there's enough importance given to the users of the outputs of the assessments. The actual users of the results of the assessments that we conduct as part of that system. Because it could be argued that it's those users that drive a lot of the value of the whole system to some extent. And when you look at the world, you realize it's a very dynamic, occasionally very unpredictable, as we saw in the pandemic, and fast-moving environment. Do you think that the frameworks of teaching, learning, and assessment are dynamic enough to meet the needs of today's world and today's test result users?
Thanks for the question. I think that if we add technology, which is something that Nick Saville referred to this morning, I think that it is flexible enough as a framework to cater for the needs of students. And whenever I think of how to integrate learning, teaching, and assessment, I also remember a quote of a book I read ages ago, and I can't remember who the author was. Maybe one of you will remember. And it was a person of the group of, Ralph Tyler, working on curriculum and conceptualization of the learning process. He said, language is work, and the work is done by the students. So I think that the key is that we change the focus slightly. We've been talking a lot about the students' needs. We've been talking about teachers. I've been talking a lot about teachers. But I think that we have to make the students also, we have to be accountable, but the students need to be accountable for their own learning as well. Students' responsibility is key. It's our responsibility to motivate the students, to provide them with all the resources that will make learning possible. But we need to make sure that self-assessment is possible, that peer assessment is possible, and then everything goes on in a much more fluid way. And what we're seeing these days is that, what I see, at least in my context, is that students come and sit the exams, final exams, standardized exams, without even looking at the samples in the website. They just come and try, and then they see the exam in action, and then they try again. It depends on the price of the exam, but in our case, the price is rather low. So they come, and then you ask them, didn't you look at the samples in the website? No, I thought, let's go and see what it looks like. So I think that this framework is good enough and flexible enough. It's a question of seeing how we can make it work. And if we now did the exercise, those of us who are still teaching, did the exercise of thinking of how the attention paid to curriculum, to delivery, and to assessment compares in terms of percentage, we could have the shock of our lives. Because sometimes the curriculum is ignored. Sometimes the standards are ignored. Sometimes assessment is only the final test, which is international. And observing classes is also something that we should perhaps do more than we do. Did I answer your question? No. Well, but that depends. I think it was clear this morning in the panel. It depends on the school. The professor talking from the Jakarta private university said that in their context, the apps that they were using was useful because their students would normally not go abroad to study. Whereas if you teach at a university where the students need to go to a UK university or to an American university, that's another one. That's another objective. The problem that we have not yet solved, at least in Europe, but I think in the world, is that in Europe, not in the UK, but in Europe, we managed to have a common currency. We don't seem to have a common currency in terms of assessment. If you go to an institution, you have to provide one type of certificate. If you go to another institution, it's another type of certificate. And all these certificates thrive because teachers not always have got their act together. Because if a teacher or a school or a government says, our students are leaving school with that level, why should that student, if this has been done properly, and shortcuts will not work, if this is done properly, that student should be able to go to Sweden and go to any university in Sweden and say, look, this is my certificate that was granted by my school. So there's a tension here. How far international exams are necessary? When are they necessary? When are they useful? And when they are not useful? Is that a bit better? Okay, thank you.